$149, or for as low as $689 in the charming village of Puerto Vallarta. See Pierre Holidays, Mexico. Call your travel agent or see Pierre Holidays.
Jay Collins gives up its Henredon franchise? It's true. We're building a brand new Thomasville Showcase Gallery, the first of its kind in Canada. But good news for you. We're clearing all Henredon dining, bedroom, and occasional furniture at half price. Yes, 50% off all Henredon pieces. Fine quality hardwood furniture to help you create a distinctive home environment. Truly tomorrow's heirlooms, all at half price. J. Collins Furniture Gallery in Burnaby, half block west of the Sheraton Villa Inn. Open 7 days a week.
BCTV, together we'll have the best year yet.
Good morning, and especially to the people on Queen Charlotte Islands, in Sandspit and on Lyell Island, and to those who work in sawmills and pulp mills and Howe Sound. They've been given a reprieve from the total freeze on logging in TFL 24. Now, I have been nagging on about this somewhat, and it all began when I got a challenge from Jack Monroe of the IWA on the 5th of September.
I have this envelope, and it's to you. And it's from a crew. Just a minute. It's from a crew in Lyell Island who are being told that at the end of this month they're gone. One, by some wilderness people who don't understand you can't have single-use forests in this province. And two, by a government, by a minister of forest who will not give them cutting permits on Lyell Island where they are legally entitled to log.
Get a little bit of the background. 1 million name signature claimed by the environmentalists, people who buy $26,000 ads in the Globe and Mail, and who accuse we idiots on the West Coast of wanting to raise, R-A-Z-E, the pyramids of Egypt. The situation on Lyell Island at that time was that the cutting permits for the 83-man crew on the island, logging activities, had been frozen pending a decision by the provincial government. This was at the time, too, when John Fraser was saying, make it a park. When Macmillan, the new environment minister, was saying, we are predisposed towards a national park in the Moresbys. Now, this is not a stay of execution. There will be and there must be a national park in Moresby, South Moresby. The question is how much of a national park and how much of a threat to the feeble forest economy of British Columbia that would be right now. But Austin Pelton, the Minister of Environment, held a press conference on Friday in which he announced a special advisory committee with a 3-month time limit to review land use issues on 16 key wilderness areas of the province and the boundaries of 8 parks. And Mr. Pelton told the press conference.
Being aware of some urgency involved in a number of the areas that will be looked at, I've asked the committee to report back within 3 months. During this period, some limited logging will continue on Lyell Island, but will not include any operation in the environmentally sensitive Windy Bay area. This area will remain untouched. In my opinion, not to allow limited logging to continue would be unfair to those whose jobs are at stake. And it is my sincere belief that with the creation of the Special Advisory Committee policy, we can look at the needs of British Columbia as a whole and bring about a new consensus in our province.
Also at the press conference was Colleen McCrory of the Western Canadian Wilderness Committee, one of the most outspoken persons for the total ban on logging in South Moresby. And she threw in her $1 million worth.
That wilderness in this province has had to take a lot of abuse on present parks, and now we have the future parks which are in jeopardy, and including further logging on Lyell Island. And I would like to express that my concern for the 1 million people that we represent, that I'm very concerned about this, Mr. Pelton, and very disturbed about it. And I would like to have us included on this committee.
And I shall be interviewing Austin Pelton, the Minister of Environment from Victoria, on the program this morning. We also have a somewhat more esoteric figure here this morning, none other than the Richard Gwyn, who's written a book about the 49th paradox. Now, that's not a straight line, that's a contradiction. We are the contradiction. I strongly suspect, however, that Gwyn, who knows where most of the skeletons in Ottawa are buried, some not very deeply, might be able to explain the paradox of Mulroney and his two-mouthed attitude to free trade and we as Canadians and our future. So Gwyn will be here too, but first, Austin Pelton, Minister of Environment, after the break. Austin Pelton has been Minister of Environment in British Columbia since the end of February, and he must be given credit, at least for taking this long simmering South Moresby National Park issue and bringing it to the forefront. What caused you to make such a quick decision, though, to lift the logging freeze on Lyell Island?
Well, as I stated at the press conference, Jack, it just didn't seem reasonable to me that we could keep these people hanging on the hook any longer over there. You know, their desperation was something that had to be attended to, and that was why we did it.
If you'd done it a month ago, mind you, Mr. Pelton said he, with respect, deference, and humility, they would be logging now, wouldn't they?
Well, that's possible, although they would have required some new cutting permits to get on with the logging.
When will when will Beban Logging now get their cutting permits? There are 6 people in the camp now, 6 families in the camp. The school teacher has been kept there. When will they be able to go ahead with making roads for the new modest logging?
Well, I think what we'll have to see is they'll still require the permits to come out of the Forest Ministry. But in the meantime, on Friday, after the press conference, just so that I could keep everyone informed, I phoned Frank Beban and told him what was happening. And he was most pleased, as you would well appreciate. And we agreed that there should be some discussion before they got on with any more logging, because, of course, some of the areas, we'd like to keep it to the least sensitive part of
In other words, you're going to exclude Windy Bay, that large area which includes these fabulous seagoing birds called the murrelets.
The murrelets, yes.
Murrelets.
Yeah,
so Windy Bay will be excluded.
Windy Bay will be excluded.
My understanding that still leaves about 10 to 12 years logging to supply the 3 sawmills and the part of the material for the 3 sawmills and the 2 pulp mills down here.
Yeah, I'm told that it could be even more than that. I was told that it could be up to 20 years.
Up to 20 years on Lyell Island alone?
Yes.
What about the proposition, which seems to be sensible on the face of it, that Lyell Island, or rather that TFL 24, which would log at 0.5% over 45 years, 112 square miles, would still leave 460 square miles for Moresby National Park. Is that not enough for the environmentalists?
Well, it's for some people the whole thing is not enough, and then of course there are others that feel differently. I find it difficult to make a judgment in that respect because I don't know that much about the impact of logging that what sounds like a very small portion of the island. Certainly I've been there on 2 occasions, and in flying over the area, you can see that there could be places that looks as if they could be logged without causing any visual impact or any problem on the preservation.
How do you feel about the intense pressure that's been put on by these massive ads in the Globe and Mail? They claim 1 million signatures. We've got people who are boasting that if they can stop all logging in Moresby, it can be the death knell of the forest industry in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. Who are these people? I mean,
well, there are a lot of them, Jack, and a lot of them are very creditable people that have written in about South Moresby. Mind you, they haven't been as vocal as others about the logging and vis-a-vis the preservation, but they really are very firm on preservation. And I'm personally very firm on having some preservation in South Moresby myself, because, you know, it's an outstanding kind of a place. But they come from far and wide. Colleen McCrory, who was on a clip just before we started, She heads a group that's very, very vocal, and that's only one of many groups throughout the province. This is why, Jack, that it seemed to me that rather than try and deal with these things, because South Moresby is only one of many places, rather than deal with them in isolation, that we should attack the thing in its whole. And that's why the committee was appointed.
But trying to be objective, Mr. Pelton, which is not easy for me in this particular issue, because I think jobs at the moment is the biggest sickness in British Columbia is unemployment. Wouldn't you not agree?
It's certainly a large problem.
But trying to be objective at the moment, which I'm supposed to be, can your committee actually survey 16 wilderness areas and the boundaries of 8 parks, South Moresby, the Stein Valley, and the Stikine River, for instance, and give you a report on which you can make a decision in 3 months?
Well, I think they can, and they think they can. We've talked to them about this particular part of the requirement of the committee, and they feel that they can do it. And I think they can do it because there's the background material, there's lots of background material available on all of these different places, and I suppose that they will want to go and see some of them firsthand. But they seem to feel, certainly the chairman and 2 of the other members of the committee feel quite strongly that they can deal with it in that short period of time.
Are they going to look at the very important issue? Perhaps we should explain that there are 3 major logging companies here involved in Western Forest Products: Domans, Wannock, and BC Forest, right? And they've raised hundreds of millions of dollars on the East in stock issues on your government's guarantee that they've got these 3 forest management licenses, one of which is TFL 24 in the Charlottes. Are they going to explore the economic disasters which face these companies if they are deprived their logging sources?
Yes, Jack, that's part of the mandate that they've been given, is to look at this very, very important part of the issue. Could involve a lot of money.
Therefore, if hypothetically not fair to a politician, it was all made wilderness, somebody would have to explain BC's turnabout on the money markets, on the TFLs, and also the financial state of these companies.
That's correct, Jack, but you know, there are costs involved in having wilderness areas or preserving areas in the province, and likewise, I suggest that there are costs involved in not doing that. Down the road there are costs involved. And it's not a perfect analogy, but I think of how many dollars that we would be saving in this country of ours right now, and how much less of a problem we would have if we had been able to address the acid rain problem, for example, many years ago, and done something about it then. And I think that when you're dealing with an area like South Moresby, that the analogy can almost be drawn in the same way, because not to preserve it would be very costly to the province.
Not to preserve the large bulk of it would be damnable for future generations.
Exactly.
Too. But we've got the economic balance at the moment, whether or not we want to see these big companies, the new pulp mill, which is to be opened in April '86, if they lose 1/6 or even 1/4 of their wood supply and their chips from all their operations, that new pulp mill, instead of being the most modern in the world, could be the biggest disaster in the world.
I guess that's always possible.
Do you think the environmentalists even care about that?
Well,
I mean, people in the East, they don't give a damn if the new pulp mill at Squamish were to be in trouble, do they?
one might wonder, but my policy is to be charitable to all sides and see if we can't come up with a solution that'll be acceptable to everyone.
Question. Do you take seriously the statement accredited to the Haida Nation's president, Miles Richardson, that the Haida people have made a decision that there is to be no further logging in that area? Do you regard, and we fully intend to uphold that, do you regard that as a physical threat?
No, I don't. I've talked to Miles Richardson on a number of occasions, and as a matter of fact, Jack, this past Friday, after I talked to Frank Bevan, I got a hold of Miles, who happened to be in Prince Rupert at the time, and we talked about this. And there was certainly no indication from our conversation that we were going to have a problem. He, as a matter of fact, although they stated, and I'm sure you're aware of this, previously, we were given an ultimatum about logging on Lyell, and but he seemed quite prepared to discuss the matter before any action was precipitated.
I was kind of surprised to see that report because I know that among the Haida people themselves there is anything but unanimity in support of Richardson's attitude. Your calls too, and more questions from me to Austin Pelton, who has just saved the jobs on Lyell Island, at least for a 3-month period. It's not a stay of execution, it's a reprieve while the whole matter is being looked at after the break. I think I'll go straight to the phones this morning.
Okay.
You obviously realize the economic consequences. What do you really think, though, of the state of our lumber industry at the moment?
Well, they're certainly having their problems. There's no doubt about that. I know a lot of people in the industry.
The question I didn't finish was, if you make a decision eventually to take away TFL 24, will that not strike at the confidence in British Columbia's promises to investors in the East?
I suppose it could, Jack.
Well, because they raised $110 million for Western Forest on a stock issue. They bought out 150 from the TD Bank. They put in 50 of their own. They've got $310 million riding on this pulp mill, which is building and going to open in April '86. And then they have to go back to the investors and say, we've lost our TFL.
Mind you, we don't know at this juncture the amount of logging that's going to go on Lyell, and that certainly is a part of the TFL. So.
Yes, but there will be some logging on Lyell to supply at least some pulp logs and chips and saw logs for the operations down here.
Right.
When will we know the exact amount? Will the forest... You've lifted your freeze, that's the important thing.
Yeah.
It's up to the Forest Department now.
Forest Department now, right.
My understanding is that they had already approved one, but they may... Do you think they'll
The
cut
license
it down?
was never issued yet. My understanding
The cutting
is
license.
The cutting license was
And
never
Windy
issued.
Bay will be excluded.
Windy Bay will be excluded.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good morning, Jack.
Morning.
Mr. Pelton. I've got 2 quotes just here. I'm looking at one from Bruce Howe, Bricks Bruce Howe, and he says, when the public owns the land, it's the government who has the sole obligation to reforest. So that's Bruce Howe. And from the Commonwealth Conference on Forest, it just happened in Victoria, here's another one for him. It's from an Australian delegate who said, are we really into free markets? The industry wants free enterprise economics when it comes to making profits, and when it comes to marketing losses, we're heavily into socialism. And then he says, our forests are God-given wealth. That we mainly slice it up and sell it without creating new wealth is shocking.
Well, that's true enough, but it's hardly on the topic for the
I
environment.
think it is, Jack. I think Mr. Pelton and this government sidestepping, making a decision and setting up a committee is just the cheapest and phoniest way to get out of making a decision. And stacking it with members of the Mining Council and the IWA and the logging companies, if that is leadership and if that is decision-making in this province, well, I'm just appalled.
Okay, you can tackle that one all right.
Well, am I allowed to take exception to that, Jack?
With all the vehemence at your command.
Well, I certainly take exception to the implication that's been made that this is a stall tactic. It's anything but that. This is an issue that's been being dealt with in this province for 12 years now. We've had a report on it that's 6 years old. We keep running into log jams. It's the reason that this committee has been set up is so that we can make a decision, so that we can decide what's going to be done. And so I just have to take exception to that. It's not a ploy, and the people on that committee, it's not a stacked committee. The people on that committee, you check them out carefully yourself, caller, and you'll find that they're highly respected people in our province, in the community, and in the world community as well. And you know, there was a suggestion made by Colleen McCrory the other day that the environmental people were not being represented. And that is incorrect. Dr. Sewell, who is sitting on that committee, is a highly reputed environmentalist who's very well thought of throughout the world. So
just a minute. You've got Brian Williams, the lawyer, Sewell, the environmentalist, you tell me, Larkin from research at the University of BC.
Right.
Let's read a very outspoken forester who is hardly in favour of logging all of the saving all of the Moresbys. Valerie Cordoban from Carrier Lumber, and you're going to put an IWA man on.
Yes, we hope to put an IWA man.
Are you going to put a man on from the mining industry?
And from the mining industry. These people, of course, are very much involved, as you'll appreciate, Jack.
But if I said to you, are you going to allow mining in the parks with a look of disgust on my face, you would say, of course not.
Well, yeah, of course not.
Yeah. But it's a very delicate area. Pacific Rim National Park, which is a national park, hasn't yet been paid for by anybody, has it?
That's right. There's about, last time I looked, there's about $60 million outstanding in that transaction.
So tell me what happened in that case was that the government phoned Mac and Blow many years ago and said, stop logging, and that no final decision has ever been made on the Pacific Rim boundaries. Am I correct? No final decision.
No final decision has been
No
made.
payment from the feds.
That's right.
Not a nickel for the national park.
Not yet.
Typical of them, isn't it? Go ahead, please.
Okay, my question is, I saw an ad in the paper, an article in the paper saying that the areas in dispute, vis-a-vis the parks, etc., only represent 3% of the total area that is currently being logged. Is that true or false?
Give me that again. The areas in dispute.
Areas in dispute, Lyell Island, the parks.
No, it's much
borders of the
more
parks,
than that.
etc.
Much more than that. The potential area of the park is something like 560 square miles. The environmentalists want all of it. The areas in dispute are TFL 24, which includes 112 square miles, which we'll roughly say is about 20 to 25% of it.
Yes, okay, that's for that particular area, but I'm concerned about the whole province. They were saying in the paper that the whole province, if you took all of the areas in dispute with the environmentalists, etc., would only represent 3% of the total area being currently logged. And I just want to know if that is correct or incorrect.
I don't know.
That would be pretty close to being correct. It's a very small percentage.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack, I'd like to ask Mr. Pelton if he saw the letter in the Sun on Saturday from a retired forester who cycled all through the province last summer and who was highly critical of the logging practices in this province. He said they reminded him of practices he saw 30 years ago when he went to Oregon. He said the areas of clear-cut logging are far too large and there's no appreciation to aesthetics. I think it's Mr. Pelton's responsibility to veto some of the logging practices which is destroying the environment in this province.
I didn't see the letter that you mentioned, and certainly I'm not a forester, so I can't comment to any.
But there is a question. Can you, as Environment Minister, alter another letter, ugly, wasteful logging practices?
We certainly have some control, not over their being ugly, but our control comes in the proximity of the logging operation to fish streams and to lakes and in watersheds. Where
well, it was certainly your department which froze Lyell in the meantime because of the environmental concerns, was it not?
Well, we were involved certainly in one area.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to Mr. Pelton. I'd like to say outright that I'm fairly impressed with Mr. Pelton. I think he's got a tough job. He's one voice in a cabinet, and he doesn't always have the cabinet behind him, but I think he's taken the right step. I'm just a little sorry that this commission, taking the opposite point of view that an earlier caller did, is I'm sorry that the commission doesn't have a little longer to look at this, because I think it should be taking public representation. What he's attempting to do is what we should have done a long time ago, and that is look at wilderness generally in this province and set some future policy for wilderness. Instead of putting out bushfires all the time, let's look at resource management and set out a long-range policy. Comment to you, Jack. You talk about only the rich will get up to see that area.
Right.
There's a ferry that goes across from Prince Rupert. There's a $400 plane fare from CPR to get up there. I've been up several times. Only the rich. It's silly to make that comment, and that's something that I'd expect from Jack Monroe. You can go up there. It is fairly reasonable. It costs you a lot less than it does to go down to Honolulu.
You will not get into South Moresby, De La Beche Marine Park, or any other part of it unless you go by helicopter or pay $1,300 per person per week on a snooty
Buy into
yacht.
Sandspit and rent a car and drive down.
Sandspit is fine. You can go on logging roads to Tallel. You can go on logging roads to Kumshawa, and that's all. Without the logging roads, you wouldn't get anywhere, said he, cutting him off. I'll be back after the break. Austin Pelton is the Minister of Environment, and he has lifted the freeze on logging on Lyell Island. That means the camp will be activated right away, but they're still to wait for the modified cutting permit, which will exclude Windy Bay. Now we go to Nelson, BC. Go ahead to the Minister.
Good morning, Mr. Pelton. I'm glad you're finally doing something about all this. In your deliberations, will you also remember, aside from the environmentalists, the other 98% of the population who are, like myself, a little overweight and only have a couple of weeks in time, and they need access to these places? If you're going to have parks, you've got to have access. I have two questions for you. One, is your committee going to do anything about the claims, the mineral claims which are in the park? Mr. John Clancy says that there must be upwards, but somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 claims which have to be resolved in the parks and hanging fire for over 12 years. And the other thing, would you consider multiple use in parks as many, many countries in the world do? My experience with parks in this area around here is that the only part of the park which is used is the part which has mining roads in, mining trails, mining cabins, logging roads, and logging buildings in. The rest of the parts of the park are not used unless the people have access. Would you care to comment, sir?
Certainly. Just first of all, though, I should mention that, as you're probably aware, the parks come under the jurisdiction of my colleague, the Honourable Tony Brummett. Of course, the reason that they were included in the press release that I put forward on Friday, which he unfortunately couldn't attend, was because they're going to be addressed by the same committee. But about the mining, yes, I'm aware that there are many claims around the province, and this will be one of the things that is looked at by the committee in their review of the economics of turning an area into a park.
But each one of these 16 wilderness areas really has got to be looked one at a time for any particular multi-use development.
That's right, and it was mentioned before that someone thought the time was short. Well, the reason that there are only 16, you know, there are well over 150 of these in the province, Jack, at this point in time, and the reason there are only 16 there is so that it's a figure that they can cope with in this 3-month period of time. If the process works out the way I expect it will, then we'll go ahead and we'll be looking at all the rest as well.
Thank you, sir. Go ahead from Courtenay, BC.
Yeah, hi, Jack. I'm one of those airy-fairy people you keep talking about. And I think you're missing the real issue here. You know, you've been talking about this for a while, and I haven't really seen this talked about. And I think the key issue here is that for the very first time, we're seeing the industry being asked to be responsible for its actions. For years and years, logging companies have done whatever they wanted to in BC. Jack Monroe said it on your program the other day. He said that they weren't doing a good job in silviculture and reforestation. The real issue here is that finally those industries, those logging companies are having to stand up and say, this is what we're doing, this is how much we're going to cut, and this is why we're doing it. And I think it's about time they did that, and I think we ought to give a warning to those logging companies.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with you. What about you, Mr. Minister?
Well, I've seen a lot of the logging that's gone on, and I must say that there is a lot of logging in this province that is being done exceptionally well, I believe, and I say that again as a layman because I'm certainly not a forester. But there are probably some areas where it hasn't been done quite so well. But I think the caller would find that in most of these areas, it's where the logging took place quite a number of years ago, and it relates to a number of things, one of them being the way they built the roads into the areas at that time.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so you had a previous caller mentioned the 3% figure on the total number of disputed areas in the whole province.
Right.
If that leaves 97% of the rest of the province or the marketable timber available, why are we even disputing these 3% areas? Why don't we just turn them over to the environmentalists?
Well, it'd be the economics of the logging, I should imagine, but we're chasing a will-o'-the-wisp here. I don't know what the 3% are, and I don't suppose Mr. Pelton does either. I mean, that's a kind of silly question. Go ahead, please. Are you there?
Yeah, hello, how are you?
Well, speak up. I'm fine.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Mr. Pelton.
Good morning.
I've got one problem. I've traveled up north of Pemberton into the Goldbridge area, and what really bothers me is the clear-cut logging that's gone on up there. There's also another thing that bothers me, and that's a lot of unemployed loggers. But put two and two together, and if you do that type of logging in the province without reforesting, 30 years from now or 20 years from now, all those loggers are going to be out of work any way you look at it. So yes. I don't know why you don't get your act together and plant some trees so these guys are going to have a job in the future.
Jolly good show. We'll do that tomorrow. We'll plant all the trees tomorrow. We're going through a history of logging practices in British Columbia. We're in an economic downturn. Some of our major forest companies are facing bankruptcy. And if you want to close down the logging industry, matter of fact, I'll tell you one depressing piece of news. One of the greatest Canadian businessmen told me off the air not so long ago that such are the world markets that we could close down all our forests for a year and nobody would miss them. And where does that leave us? Go ahead from where? Go ahead, please.
Jack?
Yeah.
My name is George Zaleschuk. I was the one who wrote you
hello,
the original
George.
letter from Lyell Island.
Right.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for what you're doing for us. First time we've had any public support out there, and we really appreciate it.
You're one of the 83 total complement in Lyell Island camp.
That's correct, yeah.
You're the guy that brought the letter here, which Monroe was waving about on the program this morning.
That's correct.
George Zaleschuk. When do you think are you still in the camp?
No, I'm in Courtney now. I'm laid off.
And you're waiting to go back up, hopefully?
That's correct.
You're a heavy-duty mechanic?
No, I'm a grapple operator.
You're a grapple operator. Well, here's Mr. Pelton, who lifted the freeze for you.
I think we met, George, when we were on the island for lunch one day. Were you there that day, George?
I think I was out working that day.
Oh, you were out working that day.
Some of us have to work.
Well, I'm pleased that something's going to happen that'll get you back to work. That's very, very important, and I'm very proud to be a part of it.
Well, Mr. Pelton, when we came out of camp, there wasn't too much hope of going back, but now that we can look forward to something, I think we all feel a little bit better.
Good.
Much obliged, George.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad you wrote the letter. And my thanks to Austin Pelton. One question, 3 months. We'll at least get the first report in 3 months. Or do you expect the whole report in 3 months?
No, I would expect the whole report.
They're going to be working from documentation already done by Lands, Parks and Housing and
Correct.
Environment.
And environment, right. Yes.
So they won't have time to helicopter all over them.
No, they won't. No.
My thanks to Austin Pelton. I'm sure Mr. Pelton will keep us in touch with the developments of the, shall we call it the Williams Committee?
The Williams Committee?
Yeah, he's the chairman of it.
Right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pelton. And next we go to Richard Gwyn.
Thanks, Jack.
49th Borough. Thank you, Mr. Minister. After the break. With wit and energy. That's a trademark of Richard Gwyn, who's written a book about Canada and North America, the 49th Paradox. Now, a lot of people like me don't know what paradox means.
Well, just for your sake, Jack, I'll tell you what it means. It means a contradiction, something that appears to be simple, but in fact is complicated. And the paradox, to me, is that the 49th parallel is a meaningless boundary just drawn across the map like that. And yet it has become a real boundary. In other words, Canadians are quite different from Americans, although we are both North Americans, and you couldn't tell the two of us apart.
Is it not a fact that in your book you say that Canadians enjoy sex more than Americans?
That is one of the survey findings. We believe less in God and we enjoy sex more. And we are more willing, for instance, to see nudes in magazines without getting upset about it. This is an important difference.
This is trivia, but on any one day, how many Canadians are there in Florida?
Oh, it's incredible. It's about 5% of all Canadians in the winter are in Florida. It's more than 2 million. And there's another bunch in Hawaii, another bunch in Arizona.
It's incredible. Now, the paradox, though, is the fact that here we are, a divided continent with different mores and different attitudes. Is Mulroney the perfect paradox?
That's an interesting question.
Does it mean hypocrite?
No, it doesn't mean, well, that's a different issue as to whether Mulroney is a hypocrite or not. The paradox about Mulroney is he started out by saying he wanted the closest relations with the United States, super relations, all that kind of stuff. And then public opinion has begun to push him in a different direction. And if you take the Star Wars decision, I can't prove this, but I'll bet that if Brian Mulroney had to make the decision on Star Wars last spring, at the time of the Shamrock Summit, to North American Irishmen, he'd have said yes. And he came out and he said no. It was a qualified no, but he said no. And that was public opinion because there's a very strong constituency in this country that wants an independent foreign policy. It's amazing how strong it is.
That wants an independent foreign policy?
They want a foreign policy, a Canadian foreign policy, to be Canadian. That's really what it amounts to. We are a certain kind of people, and they want our image abroad to reflect the kind of people that we are.
Now, your book, though, deals a lot, and it's fascinating even to me, one of the great superficial skim readers of the continent. Fascinating even to me, though, how you paint the paradox of Mulroney. Mulroney, what did Mulroney say on famous reciprocity?
Well, his view on reciprocity, he's a great historian, but he's a particular kind of historian. He reads electoral history, what happened. And of course, in 1911, the famous no truck or trade election with the Yankees, Canadians voted against free trade, and he has said in private he's never going to take that risk again. Of course, the way he's handled that risk is to call free trade by anything but free trade, enhanced trade, freer trade, liberalized trade. Slip it past.
Security of access.
Security of access. Anything you want but free trade. You must never use the phrase free trade.
Comprehensive agreement.
That's, yeah.
Yeah, do remind our listeners what he said about the elephant.
Oh, well, during the election, during the leadership convention, when John Crosbie came out for free trade, very daring for John Crosbie to do that, Mulroney attacked him and said, and he used a variation on Trudeau's line, which is that if you get into bed with the elephant and the elephant rolls over, you're in deep trouble. So he said, we'll never go for free trade.
Yeah. Now, we are going, quite honestly, I know there's a big free trade campaign on here. Premier Bennett is desperate for free trade. In fact, do we not at the moment have free trade?
That's an irony of the situation. We almost have free trade. Something like 85% of all our trade will be free of duties come 1987 when the various commitments we've already made go into effect. But we still don't have security of access. Now, we're never going to get secure access. Israel has done a trade deal with the United States, a free trade deal, and it hasn't got secure access, but it's got close to secure access. And the real problem we face with free trade is it's kind of a fork-in-the-road decision. If we say yes, the two economies, which are sort of like that now, will be like that. We can't back out of free trade with the United States. But equally, if we say no, it's our last chance. We'll never, the brass ring will never come around again. If we say no to free trade this time, the Americans will never listen to us again if we say we want this, we want that. And the real scary thing is that if we say no to free trade, in 2 years' time, American congressmen will take action against lumber or steel or potatoes or fish or whatever it may be. And we'll say, hey, what about the special relationship? We're nice Canadians, be nice to us. And they say, you had your chance and you decided not to take it. You've got to take your lumps now. So it's a vital decision that once we've made, we can't back out of it.
It's frightening. Don't you also make the point of how we, large territory though we are isolated in trade from the rest of the world, broadly speaking?
Well, we are. We only sell about 20% of all our products outside of the United States. In fact, if you exclude resources, and that's a very big exclusion, we really sell no manufactured goods to any country in the world but the United States, because some of our manufactured exports are tied aid. You know, we give money to Nigeria, say, to buy our goods. Well, that's not a real export. So that the United States is it, and we're in the position of a company that's supplying, let's say, a big department store with a whole line of products. And it's great the company's making a whole lot of money, but it has no guarantee. And if the department store cuts it off, it's dead. That company's dead.
In other words, the US has got the world to trade with, even though it has problems and deficits. Britain, for instance, has got the whole European common market to trade with. We don't have a formalized trading partnership that is capable of expansion at the moment.
We are almost the only country in the world that doesn't have a trade agreement with one other country, one other big market. All of Europe, of course, is inside itself. The United States has an agreement with itself. I mean, it's 250 million, so it doesn't need anything. And Japan is 100 and whatever it is, plus million, and it's got deals with Southeast Asia. So we are all by our little selves.
But every politician who passes this way says, we are going to develop the Pacific Rim. Is that an illusion?
Well, look, the Pacific Rim is tremendously important. I mean, that's where the world's center of gravity is moving from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But I don't think we should kid ourselves as to how big we can trade with the Pacific. I mean, you know, can we flog goods to South Korea? I mean, can we flog telecommunications equipment and all the rest of it? I mean, it's very, very tough. So we shouldn't, well, there's no doubt about the importance of the Pacific Rim. We shouldn't exaggerate it.
All right, next question. Is Mulroney giving satisfactory leadership to solve the paradox on the 49th?
No, I think this is something that personally I get quite mad about, because the government has said we're into negotiations with the United States. We don't know what the negotiations are about. And the government is adopting a deliberate strategy of telling the Canadian people nothing.
Tell me more about that after the break. I had just asked Richard Gwyn, one of the better informed experts of the Eastern media mafia, now in London for the Toronto Star, what are you doing in London? What a lucky billet that is.
It is. I am writing international affairs columns for the Toronto Star. I used to write national affairs columns. London's a great city.
Oh, you can sit there and pick your topics and chat up a few politicians, wander around the lobby in the House and turn out a piece for the Star?
Well, it's a little tougher than that because in Ottawa, I'd been there a long time, so I was sort of a big cheese. Once you get outside Canada, I'm not even a little niblet. So you've got to work, you've got to run around and make contacts.
In other words, you must feel like Fotheringham feels in Washington.
I'm exactly like Fotheringham. Nobody returns his phone calls, nobody returns mine. You've got to work at it hard.
Now, I was asking you if our friend Mulroney, could solve the paradox. And you said about his technique, his cynical technique of keeping us in the dark.
Well, I'm pretty mad about this because I think free trade, I think we can stand the political gaffe, you know, and the economic benefits to free trade. Other people genuinely feel we can't go into free trade, we can't afford it. Well, one thing we have to have, surely we can afford, but big enough, is to have a public debate about the issue. Now, the Toronto Star, as you know, a few weeks ago got hold of some cabinet documents about this issue, which were before the cabinet ministers when they made up their decision to go into negotiations. I've got one here which is called Canada-US Trade Policy Communication Strategy, which means public relations, selling the thing. And let me read a little bit out of it. And by the way, it's got secret in the top right-hand corner, so you know it's for real. Benign neglect from a majority of Canadians may be the realistic outcome of a well-executed communication strategy. A substantial majority of the public may be willing to leave the issue in the hands of the government if the government maintains communications control of the situation. Therefore, the government should adopt a low-profile approach to the general public and should rely less on educating the general public than on selling the message that the trade initiative is a good idea, which is essentially keep them in the dark and feed them mush. And I think on an issue that is the gut issue of Canadian history, you can trace it back to the 1911 election, which we talked about, back to some magnificent debates between John A. Macdonald and Wilfrid Laurier in the 19th century, back to the Loyalists coming across the border in 1784. To hide that and keep the public in a state of benign neglect, I think is just cynical. Scandal.
You have become quite a nationalist in your way.
Oh yeah, I'm a nationalist, and that's unusual. That's a paradox in the sense that nationalists tend to say, we can't afford free trade, we'll be wiped out. My starting position is instead that I really do believe that we've become a nation, that we've crossed that hump, crossed that Rubicon, and that we know who we are. We know that we are fully North Americans, every bit as North American as the Americans, but we're a different kind of North American. Not necessarily a better North American, but a quite different kind. And when you cross that border, that 49th parallel, nothing changes, the architecture, the clothes, the hamburgers, the Coke, etc., etc. But the political culture changes.
You've just told me, Richard Gwyn, that this communication strategy, has it been adopted, you know, this strategy? We presume it has.
I assume it has because all the evidence is negative. In other words, ever since the government made its announcement that it would start negotiations with the United States, it has said nothing. There have been it's not trying to have a debate. It's not trying to say, are you for it or against it? What about this? What about that? It's trying to keep the issue on the back burner, as they say, and say as little as possible so that in a year's time they'll come up with a trade agreement and everybody will be bored with the issue and it'll slip past. That's the idea.
Well, that's frightening, is it not? Especially in the hands of a man who used to sing Deary to Colonel Robert McCormick for a nickel or something in the good old days.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make any cheap shots at Brian Mulroney, but the fact is, I'm not going to.
I withdraw mine.
Yeah, well, no, I mean in the sense, I'm not trying to accuse him of being a sellout or any of that kind of thing. That's nonsense.
You're just saying this is the practical application of the delicate way in which his best advisors say he might get away with a free trade agreement. Which you regard as essential to this country.
I think it's essential economically because what I'm terrified of is that we're slipping economically. An economic gap is opening along that border. And if it gets too wide, and I don't know what too wide is, a lot of bright Canadians will go south because that's where the action and the excitement and the opportunities are. And as a society, as a political entity, we can't afford to lose too many of our best and brightest.
And you said earlier too, though, that if this slips along for a couple of years and comes through, or doesn't come through, we will meet a hammer against BC lumber imports into the United States.
If we blow this chance at free trade, we have made an irrevocable decision. I mean, it was 74 years since we last, that was 1911, looked at it and said no. 74 years in politics is an eternity. So a no is as irrevocable as
and where you want the public to keep debate, and so should everybody else, is what would happen in this country if we had, in fact, a broad, comprehensive form of free trade.
Free trade in the sense that everybody uses the word. I mean, there's no such thing as free trade. There isn't free trade within Canada. Every province has its, barriers. I mean, there's no such thing as free trade in the literal sense of that word. But as you know, what I recommend is that the government negotiate a free trade agreement, There had to be an exemption for cultural industries. That goes without saying. We had to be able to sing our own songs, speak with our own voice. And then put that to the Canadian people in a referendum. And the referendum debate itself would be magnificent. It would be angry and all the things you want. And then Canadians would make up their minds. And if they say no, we'd all live with the consequences. I would think they were wrong, but that's the decision for Canadians to make. If they say yes, we will have kind of affirmed our sense of ourselves. We'd have said, we can stand the gaff for those big Americans.
Yeah, it's a hell of a book. It's heavy in places, but I enjoyed very much the stuff about Mulroney, too. What about Mulroney?
Well,
you said no cheap shots.
Yeah. Well, what kind of shot?
Let me give you a question.
Sure.
Let me give you a question. Has his credibility been shattered by his lack of knowledge of major events within his own office? A man who was at the very centre of every Ottawa move and rumour when he was running for the leadership.
Yeah, oh, it has. I've been struck by this. I've been travelling around, of course, talking about the book, and I was in London, Ontario. That's a very conservative town. Doesn't necessarily mean a big C conservative. It's a very conservative town. I was giving a speech, and there were about 300 people there. And the tone, I mean, if I was Mulroney, I'd be very worried because there was enormous scepticism and doubt. And I think he's lost respect among Canadians.
And to lose respect in the House of Commons is very damaging to the power of a Prime Minister.
Yes, the mood was, well, free trade isn't really an issue because you won't have the guts to go for it. And free trade is a political risk because the downside, that is the industries that close because of the competition, happens today. The benefits, and every economist who's ever looked at free trade say we'll get net benefits out of it, happen tomorrow. And tomorrow is after the election, and that's tough for a politician. You need a conviction politician to do it, sort of a Margaret Thatcher.
And she's a disaster.
Well, she is a conviction politician. I mean, in her second election, she won because of the Falklands. But before that, she was prepared to lose that election. She had tough economic policies, and that was when she made a famous statement, this lady's not for turning.
That's right. So Thatcher, therefore, is a real thing, whereas we don't know what Mulroney is yet.
Well, we know where he's going. It's the next election.
And he can sing Danny Boy. I don't know if they're going to talk to you about free trade or talk to you about politics, but the man has a mind of knowledge, wit and wisdom. His name is Richard Gwyn. His wife's book was very bright.
Much better book.
What's the name of it?
Private Capital.
That was the one about the delicate Governor-Generals. I loved that book. But it's Richard you're talking to. After the break. Well, Richard, how many books have you done?
This is number 4.
Name the other 4 if you can remember them.
Oh, yeah, I can remember them all. The Northern Magus about...
that was a good book.
You remember what's his name?
That was a good one, with his cloak on the cover.
And the rose. Then there was one on Joey Smallwood. And the first one was The Shape of Scandal, which was about
that was a good book.
That was the one that almost defeated... Those are the scandals that almost defeated Pearson. And then I did a book on Joey Smallwood, who's a fascinating character. Smallwood, the unlikely revolutionary.
Yeah.
And then, what's his name? And then The 49th Paradox.
Okie dokie. Go ahead to Richard Gwyn.
Mr. Gwyn,
Sir.
Do you enjoy writing your books as much as we enjoy reading your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you work very hard, but you learn a lot. You know, that sounds corny, but it's true. One of the things I learned about was the Loyalists. I didn't know anything about them.
Because after all, you are an immigrant.
I'm an immigrant, and so I was learning about the country that I've come to. And I think the Loyalists got a bum rap in history, and I think our impression of them, which is basically a bunch of losers and a bunch of kind of mutton-chopped Tories, would be different if they'd only had one poet who could have written kind of proud, defiant verse that would have been taught to generations of Canadian children. And I think there was much more to them, and so that was one of the things I discovered, and a whole lot of things I discover when you write. The great thing about writing is you have to read.
I don't agree with everything you write, but...
No, that's I don't even agree with it myself, sir.
No, but I like the way you do it.
Thanks, sir.
Now, I have a suggestion for you. Can you imagine Brian Mulroney escorting that polar ship?
Polar Sea.
The Polar Sea. Can you imagine Brian Mulroney escorting the Americans across their Northwest Passage and Margaret Thatcher escorting the South Americans to the Falkland Islands?
That really was comic opera.
Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think the government grossly misread public sentiment about the Polar Sea and then scrambled to catch up, and did catch up, so you have to give them credit. And there's a wonderful phrase that one person, which I use in the book, a man called Abraham Rothstein, an economist, Canadian economist, talks about territorial nationalism, and he says that is the point at which Canadians, most of whom aren't nationalists, become nationalists, when it's something that's going to intrude into our physical space. And it's an issue like the Polar Sea. it's an issue like selling water. That's when all Canadians become nationalists.
Now, you and Jack Webster have one thing in common. You have a natural enjoyment of using your freedom to say things that a lot of us want to hear and can't see ourselves. And now the Great North has been exploited, I don't know how, by Lester Pearson to get in, and I think his railroads across the top there, and then Diefenbaker, and then now we have the polar sea. Now, have you or Jack has never talked much about the Northwest there, and I was wondering if you or Jack have been able to travel up there and really get to know. Is there anything to know up there? Are we missing the boat in the North? Are there things up there that we should be willing to protect?
Well, all I can say, and this really doesn't answer your question, is that one of the benefits of being a journalist is you get paid travel around the place because you have an excuse, a reason. And I've been around the North a lot, to small villages and so on, and it's fascinating. I mean, if that doesn't turn you on to this country,
on
nothing
this
will.
kind of thing, did Mulroney not commit the most amateurish gaffe by saying in effect to the Americans, it's our sea, but you don't have to ask permission? Remember all that caper? In other words, the Russians are now as free to use the North as the Americans obviously are as free to use the North. Is that not a fact?
It's a tough issue, Jack, because it's not certain that that sea is ours. We take for granted that it is. We look on a map, but in fact those islands are quite far apart. And the problem is, if that sea is ours, then a lot of the sea in between islands, say in Indonesia and the Philippines and all around the world, it belongs to those countries. So it ain't as easy as just saying it's ours because we say it's ours.
I thought it was automatic.
No, because you look at the map and you say it's only a quarter of an inch apart.
Why don't we have any visible patriotism in Canada? I interviewed a guy the other day who was from the Committee for National Committee for Responsible Patriotism in the United States.
Yeah.
Now, why don't we have it? Why do we have no patriotic fervor? Is that not one of the great things missing in this country?
Well, we're not flag wavers. That's a cliche. You notice it, of course, in Europe, because you keep seeing these kids with maple leaf patches on their pack sacks. So there is a patriotism, and I think, as I was saying earlier, that we've gone over that hump, that we've become a nation, and so the patriotism is there, but we're shy.
How about a book
Unlike
on the North
you,
there, Mr. Gwyn? Can you
Sorry, sir?
manage to stretch that out to 1,000 pages?
A book on the North.
Well, there have been many books on the North. I wouldn't have anything to add. I mean, I haven't lived in the North, and you've got to have that experience.
Thank you, sir. You can only keep fans on for so long.
Well, I like that guy. Put him back on again.
I like him too. And we're kind of light in calls anyway, which means that you've been dull this morning. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Gwyn, you referred to differences between the Canadian and the American political culture. I was wondering if you think one of the major ones is the absence of a right wing in Canada, and if you could offer some reasons as to why there is not one here.
You've read my book without reading it, sir, because that's one of the points I make.
Read
exactly
your book.
that.
Sorry.
But you've read it before you've read it, as it were, because one of the main points I make is that what's so striking is there is no, or virtually no, right wing in Canada. And while in the United States, the right wing has always been strong, even when it was out of power. And what they call the Reagan Revolution is, to me, really a counter-revolution. It's taking the United States back to its natural attitude, which is the emphasis on the individual, the magic of the marketplace, and so on. We, of course, don't believe in the marketplace. We're very suspicious of the marketplace. We're much more trusting of government than the Americans, and it starts from the beginning. Our Constitution, the old one, talks about peace, order, good government. Theirs is much more ambitious. It
talks about freedom.
Freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Quite different.
That's really good. I must remember that. Peace, order, and good government as
life, liberty,
and the pursuit of happiness.
Pursuit is a very aggressive, ambitious
Mind
phrase.
you, now that we've got the Charter, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're safe now, aren't we?
That, of course, is an American-style document. The Charter.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's commonly believed, is it not, that our friend Mr. Mulroney is setting up an executive presidential type government without the checks and balances of the Americans.
Well, we have had for a good many. I mean, that was always said about Trudeau. And
it's always the danger of the British parliamentary system.
But, you know, Thatcher is really as presidential as Mulroney or Trudeau was. It's just the nature of the beast.
She doesn't like wets or drips.
No, no. But
Makes no bones about it.
No.
Let's try for some more phone calls for you. You've not been very bright this morning.
I did my
break.
best. You didn't give me tough enough.
The man is Richard Gwyn. I don't know who does his hair. You're an old enough friend for me to ask you why you've got your hair like that.
I've always had my hair that way. It's the best way I can think of.
To cover up the bald spot?
I'd be totally bald if I had it any other way.
You know, I wouldn't dare ask that of an enemy. I'd lean across the table and clout me. In fact, I have not yet been clouted on this program.
People are too kind to you, that's the trouble.
Go ahead from Winfield.
Good morning. I just wanted to make a quick comment. Mr. Gwyn mentioned a moment ago that although we're not flag wavers, there was quite a few people traveling through Europe and Asia with Canadian flags in their pack sacks. I'd like to point out that I've traveled through Europe and Asia, and I found that the people with pack sacks with Canadian flags on them were not Canadian. They were British or American.
That's a good point. There are people who know that being a Canadian means you don't have any enemies, and so that they do sew on on little patches on the pack sacks. But a lot of Canadians who do it. I mean,
I never saw any.
Well, you missed them because I met them.
Thank you very much from Winfield. Go ahead, please, to Richard Gwyn.
Good morning, Mr. Gwyn.
Good morning, sir.
Do you think, in a general feeling, that self-sufficiency is kind of a dirty word when it comes to, the free trade or the trading practices around the world?
You mean self-sufficient in the sense of whether we as an economy should try to be self-sufficient and make all the goods that we consume?
That's right. Like, we seem to buy a lot of manufactured goods that I think we could make here, but I think we're kind of committed or obliged to buy them because it provides an opportunity for other countries to sell their goods, and Canada is like everybody's friend in this department.
Well, I mean, if you try to be self-sufficient, you produce goods for yourself at horrendous cost, and where you lose is on your exports, because your exports become so expensive. And we're not doing badly. This statement that we can't compete with the Americans because they're bigger and tougher ignores the fact that we've got a trade surplus of $20 billion with the Americans. Thank God for that trade surplus, or we'd be in terrible economic shape.
Fair enough. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Gwyn and Mr. Webster. I have 2 or 3 questions I would like to ask, but I was just, historically speaking, I've read your book, The Northern Magi, and I really enjoyed it about Mr. Trudeau. And I was just wondering, historically speaking, how would you rate, let us say, out of 10 in terms of performance, the government's performance in the first 12 months, first year of Mr. Trudeau, let's say 1968 to 1969, and Mr. Mulroney, 1984 to 1985. I would also appreciate your analysis of Mr. Mulroney has made many errors in the first year, as we well know, everything from Mr. Wilson appointing his
brother-in-law
to a high-paying patronage position, to Mr. Crosby giving his son's law firm in Newfoundland, government contracts.
I think we've got enough from you. 2 things. Comparison of Trudeau 68, Mulroney 84, and also a comparison perhaps of patronage habits.
Well, on the first point, I mean, Mulroney at the moment is in a down cycle and everybody's dumping on him. But it's easy to forget that Trudeau was not that great at all in his first term. In fact, he was very, very lucky. It was a sheer fluke to win the 72 election. I mean, he just hung on by a little fingernail. Had he lost that, he'd have disappeared from history. So that, it's not that unfavorable to Mulroney, though he certainly isn't doing very well at the moment. On the patronage thing, the Conservatives are hungry, thirsty, famished, after all those years in the wilderness. And I think Brian Mulroney made a major mistake in miscalculating in the sense that he won the election partly on that patronage issue. People were fed up with the Liberal patronage, and they really wanted and expected something dramatic, some dramatic change, and he didn't produce it. So I think it's hurt him very badly.
If I could just have one little supplementary. I know I shouldn't hog the show because I'm just a listener, but do you not feel that the recession, depression that we're now experiencing, let us say recession in Canada, depression in British Columbia, had a great deal to do with the downfall of Mr. Trudeau. His February 29th, 1984 announcement that it was time for him to pack his bags and leave. In other words, if we had an economy which was vibrant, such as it was 77, 78, or even in the late 60s, do you feel that he would have decided to step down?
Well, I think in the end, of course, what decides elections is pocketbook issues, which means do you have a job, do you have a decent income?
Yes, indeed.
And that ultimately is the determining factor, so that patronage was an add-on to that. And the unemployment, I mean, God, in BC, you guys really have terrible unemployment.
That's correct.
Right across Canada, one of the frightening things, when I was talking about that cross-border gap that's opening up between us and the States, our unemployment rate is half as high again as
That's right.
America.
They're 7%, and
We're
we're
about
10.5%.
And about 250,000 Canadians would be employed if we had the same rate of employment as in the United States.
See, this is why I get so exercised about these masterminded environmental campaigns from the East. It's all very well to sit in your duff in Toronto and say, make British Columbia a park. Last one out, put out the lights and all that kind of garbage. You've only got 8% unemployed in Ontario. You have prosperity in Ontario compared to us. And we're in the danger of becoming alienated all over again.
Not again. I thought you were alienated in the 70s. I thought we then won you back on side. Now you're mad at us again.
Well, not mad. We're just neglected. We get double talk. We have a provincial government which is performing very poorly. And even I can't blame them for the world trade slump.
No, but you know, Jack, as well as I, that a lot of BC's lumber problems are its own invention.
But they've been invented over the past 40 years of neglect and mismanagement by the big boys, by the capitalists, and by the unions.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Jack.
Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
The reason I'm calling, you asked the question, are there any true Canadian patriots? Well, maybe the problem is that we've labeled our patriots with the label of environmental radicals. And that the people that you're condemning who are fighting for parkland to be protected are protecting a heritage, you know? I mean, I believe that Canada should go for free trade because we have this huge border and it's ludicrous not to. But by the same token, we have to learn to respect our heritage and take care of it. And the thing is exactly like your previous caller was talking about, mismanagement and neglect in the forest industry has brought us to this.
All I was trying...
And hold on, and I don't think that we, as people, should allow that continued mismanagement, which is basically rape of the land. And I'm calling from BC, okay? I'm not an Easterner. I'm calling from Vancouver, okay? And I've lived in BC for over 15 years, and I've witnessed mismanagement in BC. I've seen valleys completely denuded, and that affects salmon industry. It affects a whole lot of things, and that's gross irresponsibility. And why has that happened? Except for the fact that we just exploit. Our land is exploited by American interests. Now, if we had true free trade, if we maybe even went for statehood, we'd have some say over that.
Goodbye, that's enough. He's against me. Cut him off soon.
He has a point, though.
No, but all I was trying to do, Richard, was save a couple of hundred jobs in an area already lost.
I don't know the details of the arguments, but I'm just saying, in general, there's no doubt Sweden beats the pants off British Columbia in its forestry management.
See, we had 40 years or 25 years of incredible affluence in British Columbia, unlike Newfoundland, which has always been underprivileged. And we're not used to poverty, and we don't like it, and we blame it on you.
Well, you know, there's a guy I quote, you will believe him because he's a Scot, called Jim Gilmore. He's the Director of Research for the Science Council. I quote him in the book, and he said, to me, Canadians are like poor little rich kids who never had to live by their wits. And we lived off resources. We flogged rocks and logs, and it was easy. And now we have to live by our wits, and that's why free trade is an option we should look at very seriously.
Okay, more with Richard Gwyn. We'll take any political topic now because he's in London. He can say what the hell he likes about all these people in the East. After the break. Richard Gwyn writes columns and books, columns from London, books in Canada, the 49th Paradox. You're of course totally independent commentator without any political ties or political obligations.
No, yes, I'm clean, pure, virginal, wise, unsullied by contact with vested interests, anything like that.
Good, jolly good show. It's the kind of person I like to have on the program. Somebody like myself.
Yes, we're both so pure.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm just curious to know, if we did have a totally free trade agreement with the United States, what would the ramifications be upon the Canadian dollar?
Not necessarily any, in the sense that in Europe, they have more than free trade. They have economic union, and a lot of those countries, the lira or the Deutschmark or whatever it is floats up and down. So there's no necessary connection between free trade and the Canadian dollar. You're on to a very important point. I mean, the dollar is our ace at the moment. We couldn't be selling as much lumber but for that 75-cent dollar. And we would have to make sure that the Americans don't pressure us to push the dollar up.
Like we don't need to have the dollar pushed up any further to have our trade deficit drop.
No, I mean, we are selling that $20 billion surplus in all kinds of goods. A lot of it is because of the dollar. There are other reasons. I mean, we are efficient in a number of areas, telecommunications equipment and so on. But the dollar is a big plus and we can't afford to lose it.
But, said he, exhibiting his vast wealth of industry, we kept on making 1/8 and 1/4 and 3/4 inch sanded fir plywood when nobody ever wanted it again.
That wasn't part of an Eastern plot.
No, it wasn't. Eastern management of the big companies here, of course. Go ahead, please.
While I've been waiting on the line, the subject I want to bring up is pretty well been covered, but I just want to say that it's a pleasure to read Mr. Gwyn's books and listen to yourself. I would like to repeat this question that has been brought up on this free trade issue. I understand we couldn't compete with Japanese and Korea and countries in Europe, but what puzzles me very much is that we have this 200 million market next door to ours. We have this resource of 1.5 million unemployed. We have the water, we have the minerals, we have everything. I think that we shouldn't be afraid from Americans that we could work the pants off them. We could make anything better, provided we were willing to work as hard as they are. Or I think that somebody in this country, maybe especially labor and maybe even our industry, that they are just afraid that they will be asked to work a little bit harder and maybe 15 minutes longer to achieve it.
We've got your point very clearly. Lazy Canadians, feather bedding unions, doltish management.
The two comments. An American cabinet minister actually said to me, the problem with your economy is that you've politicized it. That every decision you make, your government makes, is not an economic decision, it's a political decision. In other words, it's a bailout decision, a subsidy, or whatever. So we got a lot to learn. But the other thing, let's be positive. We don't have much of a history of entrepreneurship in this country, but I think there are three important sources of entrepreneurship that are bubbling up. One is immigrants. You know, they come off the boat, they're scared, they're ambitious, they're hungry, and they're real hustlers. Second, women. Large numbers of women are going into business, often in retailing or service industries, and that's a whole new source of energy. And the last new source of energy is Quebecers, who went into the church, went into law, went into government. Suddenly a whole generation of Quebecers is going into business. And so that's three new sources of entrepreneurial energy, so we don't have to put ourselves down that much.
Good. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but you make quite a good selling job on that, I tell you. It's a good argument for immigrants, is it?
Oh, well, I mean, without immigrants, we might as well pack up and all go home. I mean, immigrants have saved this country from itself. Well, no, but I mean, most of the immigrants have contributed enormously to the country. And what is interesting is international polls show that Canadians have the most positive attitude toward immigrants of any people, because we sense that they have contributed. And, they've created jobs and activity and wealth.
Go ahead, please, from Campbell River, I think.
Mr. Quinn.
Sir.
As being a reporter, have you ever been trapped by a politician as far as campaigning for him? Because the reason why I asked is Jack Webster. He got sucked in by the social credit over the Smears Island log. He had all the political leaders. He had the Conservatives, the Liberals, the NDP, and then the social credit sat back and waited for him to put mud all over his face. And then they come on and they announce that they can go ahead with the logging, and then he has the guests on, but he wouldn't come on his show before that.
You, sir, are extremely short-sighted and do not understand the pressure of politics.
Hey, Mr. Webster, I'm a working man, and you play both sides of the fence, and don't ever kid yourself.
I certainly do.
You're damn right you do.
As a reporter. First of all, I've been accused of, I've been accused of destroying the future of Richard, what's his name? Robert Skelly is that his name? Bob Skelly of the NDP.
Why did you do that?
Well, because I came back from the Charlottes with my zealot-type plea for these jobs. Poor Skelly was in here, and I said to him, what would you do to save the jobs? And he gave me the NDP policy on Moresby. And then Broadbent came and gave me the NDP policy in Moresby. And Turner came and gave me no sympathy to speak of for the bloody workers. Bennett, of course, stayed well away. We kept up the campaign, and Pelton appears, after he has made the decision I was looking for, to allow logging on Lyell Island. Perfectly normal crusading campaign done in a non-partisan, fully independent manner. But that was a good call from that worker, I must say. Congratulations, worker. You almost embarrassed me. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Gwyn and Mr. Webster.
Sir. That's right. Carry on, sir.
Oh, sir. Okay.
It's you. You're sir.
I happen to be sitting at home this morning trying to write a paper for school, and the question I'm considering is, why is Canada a great country? Now, I'd like to throw that up to both of you, and I'll hang up and listen, because I'd really like to see how you handle it.
Okay, write his essay for him. Richard, you're first.
We're a great country because we found a way to be North Americans, fully North Americans, without bruising each other. Our cities work. There are not many cities in North America that work. I mean, you can go out and you don't get mugged and raped while you go out to get a carton of milk. And that's a real accomplishment. We have found a way, as I say, to avoid bruising each other. Let me give you this example. Healthcare costs in Canada cost about 6% of our gross national product. In the United States, they cost 9%. They're more expensive, and there are about 30 million Americans who aren't covered by any health insurance at all. We have found ways to do things that work, like our cities work. Again, Pete, I'm not saying our way is better than the Americans, but it is quite different. And that is a real accomplishment when you've got a barrier, a boundary, that isn't anything. It's just a line on the map.
We also have a lower level of corruption, a better standard of morality, I think, by and large, in public life. We have a good basic freedom under our parliamentary system, and Canadians, since the First World War, have been great fighters for physical freedom against dictatorships.
Where the Americans have it over us, of course, is they're more energetic, dynamic, creative, you know.
Good show. My thanks to Richard Paradox, who's written the 49th Gwyn.
Thanks so much, Jack.
And I'll be back after the break. Well, I must say Gwyn was very bright this morning on the 49th Paradox. Tomorrow's programmes haven't quite planned up yet. I may do something on this thing in the food bank. I may do something on the problems in the Sikh community. I may do something else altogether. Monday. And we're back to the start of another bright, witty, hopefully active week. At least not too dull. And I'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.
British Columbia Television, this month celebrating 25 years of broadcasting for British Columbians.